I'm going to be telling you a traditional Welsh story as well. As Polly says, I'm currently living in Birmingham and I've got what we call in Wales the hiraeth, the longing to go home. So this is me remembering my home. High up in the hills of South Wales, not far from here, there's a lake. It's called Llyn y Fan Fach, Lake of the Small Beacon Hill. It's not a very big lake, in fact it's quite small, but on a calm winter's day those green waters can appear bottomless. It's also a lake that's shrouded in Welsh myth and legend. This is the story of Llyn y Fan Fach. So many years ago now, not far from the lake, there lived a young farmer named Gwyn. He was the strong and silent type. He had a weather-beaten face. He didn't laugh very much and, well, he never cried. He lived with his old man, and every day he took the cows, the buwch, up to the lakeside to graze, and every day at the end of the day he took them back down to the farm. So one day, Gwyn was up at the lakeside as usual with the buwch, and he gazed out across the lake, and in that way you do when you're not really looking at something, he noticed there was a figure standing in the centre of the lake, just standing on the water. And he blinked a few times and nope, there was definitely someone there. So Gwyn moved close to the lake and as he did so, he became aware that this figure was a woman. He hadn't seen many women. Lived in a really rural part of Wales. But he knew enough about women to know that this woman was beautiful. In fact, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Of course she was, it's a story. She had long, flowing, dark hair, and her feet resting on the surface of the lake were bare. They barely made a ripple. As if in a dream, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out the small piece of burnt bread that his mum had given him for his lunch, and he held it out. I don't know what he was expecting, but, well, her eyes flashed at him and she said, "Crast y bara, nid hawdd fan ala. You with the burnt bread, you'll not catch me." And she disappeared beneath the surface of the water. Gwyn was actually quite excited. He ran home. The buwch had a hard time catching up with him. He got home and he said, "Mum, you will never guess what happened to me." And she said, "I know what you need to do." She knew about women. The next day, she sent him up to the mountain with a piece of uncooked bread, a piece of dough. So Gwyn waited by the lakeside. He waited there for hours. The sun was high in the sky and it was just past midday. He looked out across the lake and there she was again, standing in the centre of the lake as she had been before. So he went down to the lakeside, he took the piece of dough out of his pocket, he held it out, and she said, "Llaeth y bara, teeny fanna. You of the moist bread, you'll not have me." She disappeared again. Oh, it was a bit morose. Hadn't really expected that. He walked home slowly, the buwch were trailing out for miles behind him. He got home and he said, "Ma'am, it didn't work." She said, "I've got one more thing for you to try." So the next day, she sent him up the mountain with a bit of half-cooked bread. And Gwyn waited by the lakeside. He waited for hours. It was well past midday. The sun climbed over the sky and went down the other side of the mountain. It was growing dark. It was getting cold. He was about to head for home when he saw her, standing in the centre of the lake as she had before. When he walked down to the centre, he held out the piece of half-cooked bread, and she smiled at him. And she started to walk across the water, and as she did, her feet barely made a ripple. She reached the lakeside, she held out one long, pale hand, he took it, and as she stepped onto the earth, he felt a little shudder go through her. Well, he went down on his knees and he asked her to marry him. And she said yes. Her name was Nelbach. She was the daughter of the king under the mountain, and yes, she would marry him. But were he ever to give her 3 causeless blows, 3 ergyd diachos, then she would leave him, and she would return to the watery kingdom from when she came. Well, they were married, and Gwyn and Nelbach lived happily ever after for a while. one day, they were asked to go to a wedding. It was one of Gwyn's friends' weddings. Nelbert didn't really know them. She didn't really want to go, and she was taking absolutely ages to go. And their estimated time of leaving had come and gone, and Gwyn was waiting. He put his suit on. All he had to do was put his shoes on. And he was waiting, and he thought, I'm just going to have to go in there. So he went into his wife's bedroom, and she was sitting in front of her mirror, and she was combing her long dark hair, and, well, he went up to her, and he tapped her on the shoulder, and he said, Dada, Dada, come on, we're going to be late. And she looked at him, and she said, Ngariad, that was the first causeless blow. Gwyn felt something he'd never felt before. A little pricking behind his eyes. And he knew now what would happen if he touched her like that. But he vowed he'd never do it again, and they lived happily ever after for a few more years. Until they were invited to go to a christening. The couple, who'd been married, had had a baby, and everyone was really happy because they'd been wanting to have a baby for a while. And everyone was drinking and toasting the baby and drinking and toasting the baby and singing because it's Wales and that's what we do. And Gwyn looked across at his wife and realised that she was crying. Well, she was crying because she knew that that baby would have a short and painful life. But he went over to her and he tapped her on the shoulder and he said, "Why are you crying?" She said, "Ngariad, that was the second Ergidiachos." And Gwyn felt that pricking behind his eyes, and he felt a tightening in his chest, and he knew he had one chance left. And a few short weeks later, Gwyn and Nelbert were invited to go to a funeral. As she had predicted, the baby had a short and painful life and died of illness. And most people were crying, because a few weeks earlier they'd been wetting that baby's head. Gwyn looked across at Nelbert and realised that she was laughing, because that baby's suffering was over. But he went over to her and he tapped her on the shoulder and he said, "Why are you laughing?" And she said, "Ngariad, that was the Ergidiachos Ola, and I must leave you." And Gwyn felt that tightening in his chest again, but before he could say anything, she'd got up and she'd walked out of the church, and he followed her and she began to run. And he followed her. He ran so fast, he'd never run that fast in his life, and all he could see of her was her long dark hair flowing out behind her. She ran up the mountain, she got to the lakeside, she took her shoes off, and she began to walk over the water as she had the day that he'd met her. When she got to the centre, she turned to look at him, and he thought she was crying. And then he realised that he was crying. And then she disappeared. And it was a few days after that Gwyn took his shoes off and followed Nelbert into the lake. And I suppose that's something to be grateful for. Those lovers have been reunited under the surface of Llanfairpwll.